It is my pleasure to be sitting with you, Dr. Crystal Laura,
I'm happy to be
from
here.
Chicago State University.
That's right.
And as part of our dialogue series with guest speakers we bring into Ohio State University in our College of Education and Human Ecology, it is a pleasure to actually talk with you about your research, about your philosophy on education, just about who you are.
Great.
So thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So let's just get started with maybe some general conversation about who you are. You know, what would you want people to know about you, who you are, the kind of work you do?
Great. So as you mentioned, my name is Crystal Laura, and I'm a professor at Chicago State University in a program of educational leadership. So my full-time job is teaching teacher leaders and principals and folks on the road toward the superintendency about critical issues in urban education. I'm also a high school teacher. I'm a volunteer high school teacher at a school on the west side of Chicago for formerly incarcerated adults. And both my university labor and my service are really connected to my agenda that gets executed in my research, but also just in my life, which is to sort of disentangle the relationships between schools and prisons. So I write a lot about the school to prison pipeline. And I really sort of categorize my work, I think, in three different ways. That's sort of a teacher thing, right? We do things in threes. But anyway, so I categorize my work in three different ways. I think about my university labor as sort of preventative work.
Yes.
I work with principals and other school administrators in order to prevent the flow of young people into our expanding prison nation. And then I do some community-based work, family work to support families of incarcerated loved ones. And then I also do sort of healing work, and that's sort of my high school work, community reentry, work to support people who are trying to get their lives back on track after being incarcerated.
Can you talk more about that part, the healing work that you do?
Yeah.
And why do you call it healing work?
Well, you know, mass incarceration is you know, sort of language that we're using these days, but many people have known for a very long time that being locked up takes a personal toll on individual people and their families.
Yes.
And
communities.
And communities. And so this high school that I work with is part of wraparound services that are offered to young people, some young people, in fact. My youngest student was 21. I've been there for several years. My youngest student was 21. My oldest student was 75. So,
Yes.
So young people, young at heart.
Oh, yes.
So wraparound services for folks who are coming out, who are really just trying to figure out how to get the education that they could not, how to find jobs. A lot of our students are in treatment or recovery, so how to stay clean and fight drug addiction, how to find the basic services. How do you get around town when you have very little money? How do you, right?
What about how to get employment, especially because, you know, we have so many standards by which these standards are imposed on so many young people and adults, and people who are incarcerated oftentimes find it difficult to at least get another chance.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so this organization is organized around this idea of second, third, fourth, fifth chances,
Yes.
And really trying to give concrete resources that help people move their lives in the directions that they see fit. So I want people to know that about me. I also want people to know that I'm a mom of two beautiful black boys, and so I also think a lot and write a lot about the lives and kind of the lived experiences, the schooling experiences of African American males, and so that's really central to who I am too.
That's great. That's great. So let's go back really quickly to the prevention. So you
Yeah.
started by saying there are three parts to your work, and the first you talked about was about prevention.
Yeah.
And so talk to me about prevention, and how do you actually engage in that work in order to do the kind of engagement in communities and with families and with formerly incarcerated youth and adults that you do?
Yeah. So I really think of my work at the university as a gift. Because I work with practitioners, so I work with people who, in my mind, have the institutional capacity to establish and maintain cultures within schools that could either be conducive to learning or not. So I feel a real golden opportunity to engage with school adults on a regular basis about policies and practices that we know and researchers have known for a long time either work or don't work, particularly with the populations of students who my students have access to. So I work on the south side of Chicago with predominantly Black administrators, and so these are my students serve students who are mostly Black and brown young people from the city. So there are big bodies of research that tell us about kind of what to do and what not to do.
Yes.
And so in school to prison pipeline work and literature and activism, there's a lot of energy around discipline, for example. We know that exclusionary discipline does not work across the board.
So why do we so rely on it?
You know,
Because we know it doesn't work.
we know it doesn't work. Part of it is tradition. Part of it is we do what we have been conditioned to do. We do what we grew up with. You know, corporal punishment is still allowed in 20 states, right? So even though we do away with lots of ways of excluding young people from classrooms, that is still, even though it seems, you know, kind of out of this world, that even is still a deep part of the way in which we approach harm and healing in schools. So part of it is tradition. I think the other part is that we lack the imagination to really envision alternatives and to really embrace alternatives, even though there's this huge energy around restorative practices
Yes.
to discipline. Young people in particular are really at the forefront of getting politicians to take restorative justice seriously, to provide resources and to provide support for administrators taking that seriously, for teachers trying to implement it in their classrooms. But this imagination piece is big. If you don't buy it, for example,
That's right.
if you think, oh, well, we're going to get in a peace circle, this is this kind of airy fairy way to approach this issue, when what kids really need is to get out of my class, or what kids really need is to sit up straight and do what I'm asking them to do. If there's a real difficulty with buying into this new way of, or different or alternative way to address these issues, then that sort of stands in the way.
That's right.
And it supports what we know is more comfortable, or what we know is more familiar, which is exclusionary discipline. So there's this energy around exclusionary discipline, about pushing against exclusionary discipline. So part of what I do at the university is expose principals to this information, right? So sharing this information, sharing resources, connecting my students with other people in communities who are doing it.
Yes.
That's a huge piece. You know, one thing that I'm really excited about is a kind of community of scholars that's emerging in education around leadership for social justice. So these are, administrators who claim critical theories and commitments to social justice as sort of what foregrounds their work as practitioners. And it's really exciting to know that that's happening. But it's so new that many principals feel like, well, I like the idea. The idea of being a leader for social justice is really exciting. But in reality, I have budgets to manage, I have personnel to hire, I have professional development to organize. So what does all that mean in practice?
So what does it mean in practice? And so how do we begin to think about social justice as not something we tack on to the work we do once we get the work done? But how do you encourage practitioners to center this work in everything that they do?
Yeah.
Because ultimately that's one way of pushing back against these exclusionary measures.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So part of what I do, particularly in this example of leadership for social justice, is expose my students to people who are doing it. So, I can certainly do what I can by way of research. I can do what I can by way of literature. I can do what I can by way of connecting people with conferences. But one thing that I love doing is connecting people with people.
Yes.
So making sure that my students have access to people who are doing what they do, who understand the constraints of their space, and are still figuring out, as you say, ways to sort of imbue their work with this framework. It's not something that you do extra. It's not a social justice professional development session that you do on Institute Day, but it's instead something that just guides the work.
Because isn't that yet another easy, simple way of approaching this work? We do that on Professional Development Day. And Professional Development Day might be one day a month, one day every 6 months. And that doesn't really centralize the work.
Yeah.
It's just another way of saying we've done this, let's check it off, and now let's go back to business as usual.
Yeah.
And it does nothing for our students, it does nothing for our communities, it does nothing for teachers.
Two things are coming to mind. One is a principal who is leading a alternative school for young people who are returning to school, returning students, 16 to 21. And I'd heard through the grapevine, because many times social justice education communities, are small, we all know each other.
Yes.
So anyway, I heard about her in our network, and I'd been asking questions actually that were generated from my students. My students were asking me, how do you get good social justice folks in the door?
Yes.
So rather than focusing on professional development work after people are already in your building, how do you get the folks who have the kinds of commitments that you think should guide education work from the beginning? And I've never been a principal, so I didn't have an answer to that question, but I know enough people to sort of nudge in order to get an answer to that question. So I connected my students with this principal. And she came in and talked to my students, and we had some personal conversations. And she talked very specifically about the process that her school goes through in order to find people from the very beginning that align with this idea. So, hiring for social justice suddenly became a new area of
Yes.
consideration. Okay, but it goes back to that question of how do you do it in a way that is just part of the work, it's not an extra thing. And so this was one example. Well, it's part of my job to hire. Right?
That's right.
So one thing that I can do is be really clear about what I mean when I say social justice or a social justice educator, and then I can put that in the interview protocols. I can put that in
Hiring
the
documents, policies.
Exactly. I can put that in all of our documents, and it's just a part of our institutional culture, and it is documented in our materials. Another thing that's coming to mind is that, again, a part of this university labor, I'm connected with, I have a university district partnership with the nearby suburban school district. And this district has actually been written about by our colleagues in academia, mostly because of their emphasis on exclusionary discipline. This district is struggling very publicly with high rates of suspensions and expulsions of the young people. And it's a very small district, and one principal in the district is really committed to doing things differently. So he wants to move forward with this notion of restorative justice for the entire school.
And is this an elementary, middle, or high?
This is high school.
Yes.
And so we're working together to really start having conversations with students and with staff members and with families and with community members about this tension that we were talking about earlier between exclusionary discipline and restorative possibilities or transformative possibilities, to start kind of opening the conversation to get to the point where we can say as a unit, all right, we think we understand what we're talking about when we say we want to do things differently, and we're really committed to that idea. And now we want to move forward as a collective to develop policies that reflect that commitment. So that preventative work, I think, is being executed or implemented or exercised in lots of ways, including the classroom work, including developing connections and relationships between my students and other practitioners in our area, and then also doing the work in schools,
That's right.
in communities, in districts with people who, again, as I see it, have real institutional capacity and power to address this issue in a meaningful way.
That's powerful. I mean, you're doing great work. I like the three-prong approach to how you describe yourself, how you describe your work, and connecting what you do at the university with what you're doing in schools and in the community. But then also you identified yourself as a mother
That's right.
of two Black boys. And so I wonder, what are you seeing insofar as the discourse around Black boys, Black men, particularly in the United States, when we think about incarceration and incarceration rates, when we think about inequities educationally, when we think about injustices, what are you seeing? What are you grappling with? And especially as you're raising two Black boys yourself.
Yeah, that the last part makes the question, I think, even more poignant and alive for me. The tension for me around the discussion about the condition or the frustrations or the crises facing Black males is that we can be sort of sucked into that language, right? It is true, there are issues, and there are real issues that need to be documented, that need to be addressed. We need alternatives to figure out what practices will move against what we are seeing. But I think the real trap is getting stuck in the notion of crises.
That's right.
And not thinking about sort of assets and new possibilities for what could be happening. So, and that's a real struggle for me. So even when I'm out and I'm speaking, I spend quite a lot of time addressing the problems, because we would think that the problems are well documented and they're well known, but no doubt there are some people who are completely unaware of the fact that
Unaware of what?
Unaware of the fact that Black boys are overrepresented in exclusionary discipline, overrepresented in special education.
There are people who are unaware.
There are people who are unaware.
Intentionally?
I don't know about that.
Okay.
I don't know, but I do consistently run across people who are hearing this information for the first time. So as much as I want to move in a different direction, just skip that part altogether, let's skip the problems and move on to the fun part. The truth is, many people still need to hear about the difficult part that we're creating solutions for. So I think
how would you name some of those difficult parts?
How would I name them?
Yes. Like what are some of those difficult parts that people still need to hear about, or people who might not be aware?
So because my work is so organized around school-based policies and practices that push young people out of schools and into the streets, and to kind of street economy, into jails and prisons, I spend a lot of time talking about relationships or lack thereof, and about curriculum and the ways in which curricula can be culturally relevant or irrelevant. I also spend a lot of time talking about discipline. So one thing that I name on a consistent basis is the fact that in our minds, Black boys are deficient, right? In many people's minds, Black boys are deficient, they are pathological, they are deviant. There are a lot of, and that way of thinking, that way of conceptualizing these human beings gets manifested in policy and practice in ways in which we interact with Black boys and
how
their
we
families.
teach them in our schools.
And how we teach them in
and
our
how
schools.
we push them out.
Absolutely. So, so that needs to be named, that needs to be said, and it's uncomfortable, and no one wants to believe that that's sort of the truth, but that's sort of the truth of the matter, and the numbers tell us so. But the struggle for me is knowing that I'm looking at two beautiful Black boys on a daily basis. I don't want that to be the space that I'm stuck in. I don't want that to be their reality.
Yes.
So I always want to be both cognizant of what is the fact that many young people, particularly Black boys, are consistently underserved in educational spaces, and that being underserved in educational spaces consistently is connected with the growth of our prison system. In other words, that if you're not served here, that you will be well served there. Knowing that, but also knowing that we know enough as researchers and scholars and thinkers and teachers about what works in order to prevent that I try to keep enough positive energy happening there too, right?
That's right.
And I try to raise my kids and teach my students with that kind of hope. And I really try to ground everything that I do, not only in the stark realities, but also in a real commitment to love and to justice and to being joyful throughout throughout all of this. So I think that's a real kind of lively tension for me.
So I'm sitting here thinking about your brother. You write about your brother a lot, and particularly in your book that came out just a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And so, can you talk to us a little bit about your brother and where that narrative has sort of developed and where it's gone?
So my brother Chris is a primary subject of this book, Being Bad, my baby brother in the school to prison pipeline. And I guess I should have mentioned that in my intro, because he's very much a part of how I've developed this three-prong approach and kind of why I do what I do. But he is someone who traveled the school to prison pipeline, and so I have this kind of intimacy, this kind of connection with better understanding this thing and dismantling this thing because
of your brother.
Because of someone who I love, who has experienced it in a very deep way. And so the tricky thing about the school to prison pipeline really is that you don't you can't really name it as such until someone has actually gone through the whole tragic process, right?
Right.
Up until that point, you can sort of use the literature to say, okay, I think this is what I'm seeing, I think this is where I'm going. But it's when somebody's locked up and they don't have a high school diploma and they have the same experiences around discipline, around special education, when all those things come together, when it's like, boy.
But also when you know that person.
Exactly.
And you know what you see in that person and what that person has done, and yet these larger narratives are being constructed about and around that person.
That's right.
That really goes against who you know.
That's right, absolutely, which is certainly the case with my brother. So he is currently incarcerated, and he will be throughout his 20s. And he is very much aware of the work that I'm doing. He's very much aware of me sitting here with you and having this conversation, and he is excited about the possibility of some other young person's life being spared, some other young person's trajectory being redirected as a result of someone having exposure to these conversations through my book or through speaking engagements or whatever it is. So yeah, it's certainly something that is very personal for me, and something that keeps me going.
Does he think school failed him?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think early on, he had adapted and adopted the language and feelings that he'd been conditioned to accept. So he was very much in the bootstrap kind of rhetoric. Oh, I didn't do so and so, or it's my responsibility, or I. And he was really resistant to any kind of lenses that I was trying to bring to, any kind of analysis. He was very resistant. No, I've made this bed, and so I need to lay in it. But I think with time, he's had some opportunity to think it through. And I think really that's a struggle for most reasonable, normal people, right? We deal with the immediate, and then it takes a little bit of time to realize that we can backtrack and think about the conditions that led to the I, right? So each of us has the capacity, the agency to make our own decisions, but all of our choices are grounded in conditions.
That's right.
Right? Are grounded in resources and grounded in power. And the more or less power we have access to changes our ability to make certain choices. So, I just think it has taken him a little bit of time to come to the place where he was ready to release some of the blame.
That's right.
And to really think more broadly in a more complicated way about how things could have gotten to the place where they are.
Well, I will say, when I read your book, I was sitting there and I just could not put it down. And I read it, and then I said, we have to bring this woman here.
Thank you.
And the work is powerful, transformative, real, deep. It is painful, it's a struggle.
Yeah.
And I read your book, and I was thinking about just all of the people who I know, even in my familial community, who have been just, I don't even know how to say it, assaulted by this larger system in which we all live, and who turn to school as a safe space, as a place where we could become who we want to become because we have powerful people there who could help us to think about the world in a different way, and how that just really didn't happen for so many people. And in this case, particularly for Black males. And I just wonder, how do we begin to interrupt that discourse around schools and schooling? And for so many people I know, schools are hostile places. Schools are places where there is no sense of safety, there is no sense of arrival, no protection, and instead we get punished, and there are consequences for the behaviors that we might enact within that particular type of space. And so I've been reflecting a lot on the ways in which schools are constructed, especially in the United States. And I wonder what you think about, what do we need to do differently to really affect some type of change institutionally when it comes to public schooling in the United States, especially for Black boys?
The first thing that comes to mind is that we need to listen to the young people.
Yes, indeed.
I feel like, if we ask young people what they think they're up to or what they think we're up to, and we pay scrupulous attention, and then we try to interpret to the best of our ability what we've heard, then we would be in much better shape than we are right now.
Why can't we do that?
I don't know. We don't trust young people, right? We've all aged out of the youth movement, and suddenly, we have something against youth. But I think that young people are really attentive to the BS meter is is really sensitive for young people.
Yes.
So they have real insights about what's working and what doesn't, and what makes them feel good, and what makes them feel appreciated, and what makes them feel welcome or not. And so I think that part of our inability to listen and our inability to look at young people as experts is the problem. But I also think we have a real attachment, unhealthy, strange, bizarre attachment to punishment. We live in a culture of punishment. We live in a society where, prisons, for example, are our go-to mechanism for every social problem.
Everything.
For homelessness. Well, if you're homeless, you can't sleep on the benches. Vagrancy laws, you get locked up for that, right? If you have some kind of mental illness, lots of folks who are locked up have mental illnesses. So all of these social problems that really need social solutions,
yes.
We live in a place where the only thing that we can conceive of as a reasonable and responsible response is prison. So, in other words, we are organized around, very rooted and deeply rooted in this notion of punishment. So I think that trickles down really easily into our schools as an institution, and so we run our schools with this idea in mind. So, so combining, sort of stretching our imagination of how we can organize spaces, right? That's one thing. Listening to young people is a whole other thing. Training people to do that. So, teacher education, leadership preparation programs have to be, I think, held responsible for and accountable for cranking, educators out who are socially responsible, who are critically conscious. And, maybe I'll get pushed out of the profession for thinking this, but I think that, if you don't think critically,
you don't need to be here.
You don't need to be
in this profession.
And you don't need to be. You need
or
to
in
come
any
up with
profession,
something else.
really.
Exactly. I firmly believe that if you don't see these issues as issues, and you don't have sort of a global perspective of what's going on, that you should choose another profession. So I think that that's also part of the issue that
if
we
you
need
get
to
pushed
address.
out for saying that, then I'm going to come right with you and be pushed out too, because that's exactly right. That's right. I like it. It's great.
Okay.
Wow. There's so many questions I have for you, but I have to ask you this question about. So you write about Chris. You write about Black boys. You talk about how you have 2 Black boys yourself. Where are the Black girls?
Where are the Black girls? I've gotten that question before. It's true that Black girls are struggling with many of the same issues that their male counterparts are, and that the stats for what's happening with Black girls, particularly with regard to suspensions, with expulsions, are atrocious, alarming, stark. It's also true that Black girls bear the brunt of real life issues that boys don't, right? So Black girls have to deal with issues of teen pregnancy. 1 in 4 Black girls has to deal with teen pregnancy. Dealing with issues of maintaining a household. Many Black girls are still struggling with that, and so those are things that are not responsibilities that many of their male counterparts have to deal with. Still, it is true that Black boys and Black girls both need attention. I think so my work is organized around Black boys because that's the space I occupy, right? So this isn't to say that Black girls shouldn't have shouldn't have a whole level of scholarship. They should, and in fact, some really smart, wonderful people, Kimberly Crenshaw, has really started a movement to organize people and get people galvanized around conferences and colloquia and workshops and writing and community-based organizations, and even calling on President Obama to sort of broaden his My Brother's Keeper initiative to include Black girls and to figure out other ways to create a more expansive approach to how to support youth of color. And I'm all for that. I think that there ought to be more work. I also know the limits of my own work. I also know kind of what I do well, and I know what I do, and I know why I do it. And so though, as a former Black girl, now a Black woman, I feel the need in a personal way for that kind of work. And I think maybe at some point I'll get into it. But right now, when I wake up each day, I look at my little boys and I think, how can I be a better mother to them? What work do I need to both conduct and also be very privy to? Like, what do I need to be reading? What resources do I need to have access to in order to be better to them? And then, of course, when I'm looking at them, I'm thinking about all the other brothers in the city,
Yes.
right? And then I go to work and I look at my principals, and then those are the folks I'm thinking about. So, you know, I think that's a legitimate question. Where are the girls? And we need more work around girls, and we need lots of people, smart people who are committed to better educational experiences, better life outcomes for Black children, but also especially Black girls to do the work. I just know at this point where my commitments lie and what I can do well in the here and now.
Yes.
And so, you know, I hope to broaden my lens very soon and join those folks.
Great, great. Well, it is a pleasure talking with you, Dr.
This was
Laura.
great.
You know, there's so many questions. There's so many things I want to say. I want to talk to you eventually about activism. And you've referenced activism already, but talking to you about activism, I'm curious about what you think about resistance. I would love to know if you think that schools really can be transformed, especially for Black boys and Black girls. And if so, what does that really involve? And who needs to be at the table, who historically have not been at the table or not invited to be at that table? I am curious to hear you talk about parents and families and the role of this larger community and making sure that if we're talking about harm and healing, how do we talk with other people about that work? And so this is all to say that the conversations will have to continue.
Great.
But you are phenomenal.
Thank
you are a
you so
powerful
much.
scholar. And it's just been my pleasure sitting here talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been fantastic.
Thank you so much for joining us. So Dr. Crystal Laura, thank you.